Free will is a recurring theme not only in contemporary philosophy, but also in medieval philosophy. There are two sorts of questions, philosophical questions you can ask about free will. One, what is the nature of free will? In other words, what would be required in order for some choice to count as freely chosen? And also whether we do indeed have this sort of freedom, whether the conditions that we've just laid out are obtained in our case. These are still the two senses of the question about free will that are present in contemporary philosophy. We've read a few authors during the medieval period that have something to say about the nature of free will and whether or not we have it. We saw Augustine and Boethius wrestle with the problem of divine foreknowledge and whether it undermines our freedom and what sort of freedom we might have in light of God's knowledge of the future. We also saw Aquinas' account of free will based on the complicated interplay between the intellect and the will. Now what I want to talk about is Scotus' contribution to the debate on the nature of free will. In the sections that I had you read, Scotus is discussing what free will looks like in three sorts of things. One, he wants to look at the nature of God's freedom. Two, he wants to look at the nature of angelic freedom. So freedom for Satan to choose against God. And also he wants to look at the nature of human freedom. Along the way, we see some commonalities between these three entities, something that seems to be present in all of their freedoms. I want to focus, though, just on two of them. I want to focus on Scotus' account of divine freedom, and I want to focus on his account of human freedom. Let's start with divine freedom, then. Anything that God does freely. God also seems to be free in the sense of having alternative possibilities at the moment of decision. For example, when, if he's eternal, when is sort of a weird way to put it, when God decides to create the universe, he can just as easily make an entirely different universe than this one, or no universe at all. God was ultimately free in choosing whether to create and what to create. Here's a key question, though, or a potential problem with respect to God's freedom, though. But if God's intellect is perfect, such that it necessarily perceives what is truly good, and with unfailing certainty determines which available course of action would best achieve his purposes, and if God's will is perfect also, such that with unfailing reliability it inclines God to what his intellect unfailingly determines to be the best course of action, then how can God have any alternative possibilities available to him at the moment of decision? Here's a statement of this worry about God's freedom from page 593 from the reading that we did from Scotus, from the first reading. He says, now God moves through intellect and will, so we must look for the cause of contingency in beings, either in the divine intellect or in the divine will. But this contingency is not in the divine intellect insofar as it presents anything to the will, because whatever it cognizes before an act of will, it cognizes necessarily and naturally, in such a way that there is no contingency in it with respect to opposites. This is why there is no practical knowledge in God. For if, before any act of the will, his intellect apprehended that something was to be done or produced, would his will that necessarily or not? If necessarily, then God is necessitated to produce it. If he does not will it necessarily, then he wills contrary to a dictate of the intellect, and in that case his will would be bad, since that dictate could not be otherwise than right. So the worry here is that, well, look, God's intellect is perfect. It always properly evaluates what would be the best course of action. But God can't go against what would be the best course of action. That way he'd be acting irrationally. And God can't act irrationally, so it looks like it doesn't have any alternative possibilities. It looks like whatever his intellect presents him as the best, and it will always unfailingly do so, that's what God has to will, given the perfection of his intellect and the perfection of his will. So how do we get around this? How do we make room for divine freedom, given this puzzle, given this paradox? Scotus' answer is essentially to say, which is actually sort of a bold proposal, that prior to God's willing, no course of action is good, and no course of action is any better than any other. Here's what he says on page 593. Hence, when the divine intellect apprehends this is to be done before an act of will, it apprehends it as neutral, neither true nor false, just as when I apprehend there is an even number of stars. But when by an act of the will it is produced in existence, then it is apprehended by the divine intellect as a true object in accordance with one member of a pair of contradictories. So one must locate the cause of contingency of things in the divine will. This does sort of seem to solve the problem. It means that, right, the intellect, as perfect as it is, can't ever present some course of action as being better, as in like morally better, than any other. Why? Because there is no fact of the matter what is good or bad prior to God's willing it. So this seems to commit Scotus to a kind of divine command theory of goodness. We'll talk more about divine command theory when we get to Scotus's ethics. And it seems to commit him to a divine command theory in ethics as well, as we'll see, according to which whatever is willed by God is by definition good, and nothing is good or bad prior to God's willing it. We'll come back to this implication later on, but set aside for the moment Scotus's account of divine freedom. There's the puzzle about how can God act freely, how can he have alternate possibilities in his decision to act, given the perfection of his intellect and his will, and his solution is to place goodness or badness solely in God's will. So prior to his deciding, nothing is morally good or morally bad. And that is what Scotus thinks allows God to be free. But set aside that for a second. Let's talk about his account of the nature of human freedom. Remember our key question from our discussion of Aquinas' account of human free will. The key question, or the key puzzle here was, does the will necessarily incline the person toward whatever course of action is presented to it as best by the intellect on that particular occasion? It looked like Aquinas' answer to this question was yes. Even when the will moves the intellect to consider different goods, or the same good from a different aspect, or disregards the intellect's recommendation, it can only do so if it has been given a good reason to do so by the intellect. So whenever you sort of refuse to do what the intellect shows you is the best option, according to Aquinas, it always has to be because the intellect has given the will some reason to do that. So it really all comes back to the intellect. Whatever you have the best reason for doing, that's what the will inclines you towards, according to Aquinas. At least that's how it looks like. That's what his account looks like. Scotus thinks that Aquinas' position undermines our ability to act freely. For if the will necessarily inclines the person toward whatever course of action is presented to it as best by the intellect, and the intellect is in some sense outside of the will's control, it just evaluates, then our will is determined by something outside of its control. Scotus thinks that free will requires alternative possibilities at the moment of decision, the ability to have done otherwise than as one did. A clear statement of this is on page 594 from our reading. Here's what he says. In the same instant in which the will has one act of willing, in and for that very same instant it can have an opposite act of willing. Thus, if we conceive of a will that exists for one instant and in that instant wills something, then it cannot will and will against in succession, and yet in and for that instant in which it wills A, it can will against A. After all, its willing in and for that instant does not belong to the essence of the will. It is not a natural passion of the will. Therefore, that willing adheres in the will contingently. But the opposite of a contingent accident is not incompatible with the subject for that instant. And so a will that wills A in and for this instant can will against A in and for that very same instant. So, subtle doctor, right? That's a very sort of complex and subtle way of putting it. But clearly, Scotus is committed to the idea that free will requires alternate possibilities at the moment of decision. It's less clear that Aquinas requires that. It's less clear that Aquinas can give us that, given his account of the interaction between intellect and will. Scotus thinks that Aquinas' account cannot give us these alternate possibilities, and we need them. And so therefore, in Aquinas' view, the will is not really free. So how does Scotus want to adapt this account? How does he want to provide for a kind of alternative possibility free will for the will? Here's Scotus' solution. Scotus agrees with Aquinas that the will is a cognitive inclination toward the good. But Scotus introduces two sorts of goods towards which the will inclines, and two sorts of inclinations found in the will. what he calls the affection for the advantageous and the affection for justice. The affection for the advantageous is the will's inclination toward the greatest advantageous good, happiness. The affection for justice is the will's inclination towards the greatest moral good, justice. Because the will has two sorts of inclinations, it is not necessarily inclined to either. The will is free to pursue either advantageous goods or moral goods. And this dual inclination gives the will alternative possibilities, even in those cases in which the intellect presents to it some course of action that will best achieve the agent's happiness. The will can, in those cases, incline the agent against his or her own happiness and toward what justice requires. But how can it be morally good to go against one's own happiness? And how can it be morally bad to pursue one's own happiness? For Aquinas, this is not only impossible, but incoherent. That an action conduces to your true happiness is what makes that action morally good. Necessarily, every morally bad course of action is an action that undermines your own true happiness. In suggesting that a person can go against his or her own inclination to happiness, and importantly, can do so based on the demands of justice, Scotus is signaling that he rejects the very foundations of an Aristotelian ethics, according to which moral goodness and true happiness coincide. He is purposely divorcing morality from happiness. Here again, we see Scotus's apparent commitment to some kind of divine command theory, according to which performing morally good actions is a function of doing what God wills, even if that runs contrary to your reason and to your own happiness. In any event, that seems to be what he is doing here. We'll have to take a closer look at his account of natural law to see how willing he is to accept these apparent consequences of his account of divine and human freedom.